Beyond just configuring the connection manager to direct the data in the pipeline to the destination, you'll need to map the columns in the data flow to the columns in the destination store. You'll do this using the mapping page in the Destinations Editor dialog box. Data flow destinations provide connections to databases, not just SQL Server, flat files, XML files, and other physical data stores. A data flow destination component reads data from either a data flow source directly, which is just about the simplest useful data flow that you can have, or the last data flow transformation in the flow, receiving the data in columns from the data flow pipeline. Some destinations require the use of a connection manager, just as data flow sources do. There's a number of data flow destination types that you can use, and these are all found in the Data Flow Destination section of the toolbox with the Data Flow Designer selected. First one is an ADO.NET destination, loads data into a database using a .NET data provider. There's a Data Mining Model Training component. This is a destination for use with data mining tools in analysis services. Data Reader destination. This exposes the data flow as an ADO.NET data reader object in memory for consumption by an external .NET application. This is a good tool for debugging data as it travels through your project. There's dimension processing, which loads and processes an analysis services dimension in a cube. There's an Excel destination. Well, what comes from Excel, I guess, can go to Excel. Flat file destination of various kinds. So again, it can be a text file, comma separated file, or other type of file that uses any kind of plain or delimited text. ODBC destination writes data using the ODBC API. But as with data sources, you generally should use OLEDB for data stores that have it available. But a lot of data stores only have ODBC. Then there's an OLEDB destination, and that uses OLEDB standard and OLEDB provider. And the nice thing about this is that most databases these days are compliant with the standard. And then there's partition processing. This is a destination that automates the processing of analysis services database partitions. Raw file destination. This is a proprietary format, again, that Microsoft developed, and it allows faster transport. And then there's a record set destination. This uses an ActiveX data object, ADO, which is the predecessor to ADO.NET, in order to load an in-memory data set. So this is an older data access technology that you should use only if you need to support backward compatibility with older applications. Generally, you should use ADO.NET instead of a record set destination like this. And then there's a SQL Server Compact destination. This is a destination that's specifically made for the SQL Server Compact Edition. And that's just a free stripped-down version of SQL Server for desktop applications. And then there's a SQL Server destination, which is specifically made for SQL Server that provides faster transfer of data, depending on the circumstances. And it can be a bit trickier to configure than an OLEDB destination. Now, all of these data flow destinations draw on the same kinds of connection manager types as data flow sources, such as OLEDB sources and flat file sources. All right, one note about the choice between the SQL Server and OLEDB destination. When choosing, you need to consider where the data flow destination lies. If the destination is on the same server as where the integration services package is running, the SQL Server destination will have the best performance. But if the destination is not on the same server where the package is running, then you can't use the SQL Server destination and have to instead use the OLEDB destination. And that's because the SQL Server destination uses in-memory buffers in order to communicate with the SQL Server. So, downside is it means the SQL Server destination is less flexible of the two destinations, but it can be more efficient. To tell you the truth, I usually just reach out and grab the OLEDB destination. Makes it a little bit easier. It's always consistent. I'm always configuring it in the same way. But if I really needed the best performance, I'd probably look at using the SQL Server destination as long as the destination is on the same server as I mentioned. In this exercise, I'm going to add a data transformation and a destination to a package. I'm going to continue working with this dataflow.dtsx package that I created earlier when I talked about data sources, and I added that OLEDB source. Okay, so the first thing I need to do is come over here to the SSIS toolbox and come up to Transformations. And in this case, I want to use a derived column transformation. So I'll drag that to the surface here, and I'll move it over there. And I'm going to use this in order to combine the first name and the last name columns from the customer table into a single column and convert the result to uppercase. So that's a little bit of a contrived, but an example of what you can do in order to inject a new column into the data flow pipeline. And in this case, make the contents of the column based on other fields within the data flow pipeline. But also there's other ways of incorporating data, creating new columns, by bringing it in from other sources as well. So you have a lot of flexibility to do this kind of an operation. All right, anytime I add a new transformation or destination to the data flow, after I add it to the designer, the very next thing I need to do is select the predecessor and click on the arrow here in order to link those two components together. Because a large part of configuring this new component is looking at the data that it's getting from the pipeline. By connecting these two components, this component now has the information it needs in order to know what columns and the data types and so forth, the entire schema, about what it is going to be getting in. And then I can take that information, configure the component, and then produce the output that this component generates. All right, I'll double click it, and that opens up this derived column transformation editor. So as you can see, there's a number of panes. There's various variables that I can use. In this case, I don't have any package variables or other variables at different scopes. There's only system variables, so I can use that as part of the transformation. I also have access to the columns in the data flow pipeline. So this is why it's necessary to connect this component to its predecessor to get this information. If I hadn't done that, then this information wouldn't be available, and I couldn't configure the component. And then over here, I have access to a number of different functions and operations and operators that I can use in order to define the expression that is going to create the new output. So I'm going to come here to string functions. And I'll scroll down until I see the upper function there. And if you're not sure what it does, it returns a character expression after converting lowercase characters to uppercase characters. Okay, so you get some information about what each function does. So it's definitely worthwhile to explore what some of the other available functions are, as well as the operators that you can use. So I'm just going to drag that into this expression column here. And notice that it gives me this overall syntax for that upper function. So name of the method is upper, parentheses, and then I have to give it some sort of character expression. Okay, so this is going to be the derived column name, so I want to change that. Derived column 1 just isn't a very meaningful name. So I'm going to change this to full name. Okay, so I hit enter, need to stay in that row. And I'm going to add this as a new column. But I can also replace some of the other columns here too. So I can modify columns as well as add a new column. But I want this to be a new column. I want to preserve the first name and last name. And so I'm going to leave the default setting set there. Okay, now I need to flesh out the expression. Notice that the expression is red. That is the built-in expression parser at work. It sees that there's a problem since I haven't yet provided valid input to this function. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is take first name, because remember what I'm going to do here is I'm going to concatenate together the first name, a space, and the last name, and then convert the whole thing to uppercase. So I'll drag this over here. It knows that we need to replace that placeholder there, that character expression, so I'll just drop that there. So that's kind of a nice feature. It's sort of a mini editor where it automatically selects what I need to replace within the expression. Okay, so I need to flesh out this expression. Next thing I need to do is add a blank space. So I'll add double quotes, space, double quotes. And then I can drag in the last name, which is right there. And I will drop that there. Notice that there's no text that's highlighted because it's smart enough to understand that I need to drop that in a particular location. I'm not replacing other invalid text there. Okay, so there's my expression. Notice it's still red. It's just because I haven't moved off it yet. And so there, I move off it, turns black. It's parsed that correctly. So this is a valid expression. Still, other things can go wrong at runtime, but at least the syntax is correct now. Okay, then there's various other things I can set. I'm going to leave the data type set to a Unicode string. And then there's various other items that you can select, some of which are really precision and scale or only applicable to numeric values. But I could change the length as well. 101 is plenty of room for a combination of the full name and first name and last name. Okay, so I have configured that expression. I'll click on OK. And now I've configured this derived column. And notice that the red X is gone. Okay, so I've now configured a transformation. So the next step I need to do is provide a destination for the data. Okay, so I'll come back over to the SSIS toolbox, and I'll scroll down to Other Destinations. Now, the other just means that these are all of the destinations rather than the destination assistant. So may or may not be the best name for that section of the toolbar, but it is what it is. Okay, so in this case, what I'm going to do is use a data reader destination. So I'll drag this over to the data flow, put it down below the field there, and then select derived column and drag this blue arrow for the data flow over to the data reader destination. And now this destination has all of the information that it needs as far as the schema for what it is getting, the data that it is getting from the derived column. Now, one thing that's interesting here is that notice that even though I have the data reader destination selected, there aren't any arrows here. That's because this is the end point of the data flow pipeline. I may have other endpoints. I can have multiple pipelines within the same data flow. But in this case, this arrow right here, this is a terminus of that. So I can't connect the data flow. It produces no output is really what I'm trying to say. Okay? All right, so we need to configure this. Notice I have no red X, so it'll operate just as it is. But there are a couple things that I need to do. These are component properties and have a whole bunch of different properties that you have here. What I need to do here is change the read timeout. And I'm going to change that to a value of 0 and press enter. Now, I need to step back for a second. The data reader destination is an in-memory destination. Remember I talked about it as part of ADO. Not something you want to use typically, but for this very simple example where I really wanted to focus on sources and destinations and how you configure them within a data flow, I just needed an output for the data. So this is an in-memory destination for the data flow pipeline. Now, in general, when you use a data reader destination, to actually use the generated data reader object in an application, you shouldn't set the timeout property to 0 like I just did. Shouldn't do it in a production environment. But here, I'm just using the destination object as a terminus of the data flow. As a terminus, if you don't set the timeout to 0, the package will pause for the default 30 seconds before completing execution. So the setting of 0 is just for convenience, so the data immediately disappears. So that's the only reason I'm making that change here. But it's one of the idiosyncrasies of this component that you need to understand depending on how you use it. All right, so let's take a look at the Input Columns tab here. This is where you select the columns that are going to be saved to the destination. This is the output form of this component. So I am going to save, I'll expand this a little bit. Okay, so these are all of the columns that the component is receiving as part of the data flow pipeline that it is getting as input. Okay, so I am going to select full name, which is right there, customer ID, and first name and last name. And as you can see, it output those items that I selected into this grid here in the order that I specified. And then it identifies the input column. This is the column that's coming from the pipeline, and the output alias. So if I select that, I can change the file name that is actually stored to the destination. Now the order really doesn't matter, but this is the order that they're going to appear within the data reader. And then I can also set the usage type to read-only or read-write. So that's the thing about using a data reader. Okay, so that now configures that component. I'll click on OK, and now that destination is completely configured. So I'll save my work to this point. All right, now I'll go ahead and execute it to test it. A little compilation. Notice that it's very fast. You can see that it moved 847 rows. So that's the number of rows that it moved, that it read from the table, processed. Now this transformation read each row and passed it through to its output. But there are components that you can filter the rows as well. So input of 847, depending on the transformation, isn't necessarily going to produce 847 rows. Could be 847, could be fewer, could be none, could be more, depending on what you're doing within the transformation. Okay, so at this point, we have a complete package that reads data from the AdventureWorks LT database, creates a derived column that concatenates the customer's first and last names, and then saves the data to a destination. It's an in-memory destination, but that works for this example. The source and destination assistants are a new feature of integration services in SQL Server 2012 and are available by default in the Favorites section of the SSIS toolbox, but you can move those around if you want to. They make it easier to create sources and destinations for a data flow, in part by displaying by default only the data providers that you have installed and available for use on the machine where you're developing the integration services package. Both assistants start with this dialog box. Only the title of the dialog box is different based on whether you selected the source or destination assistant. You can opt to uncheck the Show Only Installed Source Destination Types, which is checked by default, because that controls whether or not it shows all data providers, whether you have them installed or not. So you can use other providers. They just may not be available at execution time. So then, once you select a destination type, you can select either to create a new connection manager or use an existing one, if you have any. If you opt to create a new one, you can click the OK button, which then opens another dialog box that's tailored to gather the information needed to create the kind of connection you want. If you select an existing connection manager, it'll immediately create the new source and add it to the data flow. It's basically the same process as creating a connection manager as you use if you use a dedicated component, but it just guides you and simplifies the process a little bit.